Hello and welcome to CPSU webinar on ACEs, toxic stress, and why this matters in sport and physical activity. And today from the webinar, what you'll get is be able to understand and explore what ACEs are, the importance of them, and why it matters within the sporting sector, and what we can do to help improve young people's resilience and resistance to ACEs. So I don't know whether you know much about ACEs. There's been lots of information on TED Talks, YouTube videos, Harvard Children's Society, Harvard University. They've done loads of information on ACEs, but it originally came out in about 20 years ago from the USA, and it was something developed by the Center for Disease Control, and they did a study of 17,000 people in San Diego, and what they found was two major things. They found that there was a correlation between the amount of ACEs, a person's ACE score, and poor health outcomes. And that's what you can see. There's that correlation between kind of the less ACEs, and the more ACEs you have, the more health issues and poor health outcomes that a person would have. And the second thing that they found was that it was common, and it affected 2/3 of the population had one ACE, and 12.6 had one, or 1 in 8 had 4 or more ACEs. And it was the interesting thing about the study, and I think sometimes people's misconceptions around ACEs, is that it tended to be within lower working class demographic societies, communities, and it's not, because this study of 17,000 people was for 70% of the population were white and had a university education. So that kind of blows out the myth out the water that it's an inequalities issue, and it's not. ACEs affect everybody, and I think that's really important that we remember that. So in terms of what ACEs are, they were categorized, the 10 ACEs for a person's ACE score, and they were divided into 3 main categories or main topics. The first one was abuse, and that included physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. The next category was neglect, and it covered physical and emotional neglect. And then household dysfunction, so looking at parental mental health, being in prison, substance misuse, domestic violence, and divorce. And if you think about it, lots of those things can affect many, many different people. So it's really important that we are aware of what type of things cover as an ACE, but also making sure that we are able to recognise those concerns. So how does that translate to the UK? So these are some of the figures which were developed by social work assessments, and that was from 2017 to March 2018. And as you can see, there are multiple areas where ACEs factor. So if you can see the domestic violence and neglect and failure to protect is quite a key area. So that's here. So if you can look at this, so if you've got domestic violence, 51% of social work assessments had domestic violence featuring in them. And you've got drug and alcohol, which equates to 40 odd percent, nearly 40% of safeguarding referrals to children's services, and the final outcome of the assessment involved drug or alcohol misuse. And you also had a combined mental health was 42% as well. So that's showing that these ACE scores impact on social care assessment. So social work assessments coming through the door of young people are impacted significantly by those concerns. And in terms of the previous year, I think that there was been a lot of awareness raising done over from the previous year, because domestic violence was up by 10,000 cases and mental health was up by 18,000 cases. So that's showing that awareness raising is increasing the amount of referrals to children's services so that they can hopefully signpost and provide adequate services for those children experiencing those concerns. The NSPCC do lots of research, and one of them is how we know our children are safe report, and that was 2018. And what they looked at was for young adults between the ages of 18 and 24, a quarter of them had experienced domestic violence. And for those young people between 11 and 17, they had experienced emotional abuse as well. So 2/3 of those had experienced emotional abuse in the past year. So that is another reason why we need to make sure that we are referring concerns through to the NSPCC or to Children's Services. So we've got a bit of a quiz, and just wanted to highlight some concerns that are out there. So domestic abuse accounts for what percentage of violent crime? So is it 2%, 10%, or 25%? And the answer is 25%. So all violent crimes, domestic violence is 25% a factor within them. In Britain, a woman is killed by a partner or former partner is it every 3 days, every week, or every 2 weeks? And it's every 3 days. So for me, that's a really staggering figure, that a woman dies every 3 days because of domestic violence. So that goes to show how important it is we raise those safeguarding concerns, because young people could potentially be living in a very violent environment. And how many children have a parent in prison? So is that 100,000, 250,000? That should, yeah, 250,000 that should be, and 200,000. And the answer is 200,000. And out of those figures, 17,000 children have experienced their mum being sent to prison. And within last year's figures, 83% of women sentenced to prison had committed a non-violent crime, and 62% of them were serving less than 6 months. But if we think about how that impacts on the children, 1 in 20 children remain in a family home if their mother's sent to prison. And that's startling, isn't it? If you're thinking only 1 in 20 children, if their mother goes to prison, will remain in the family home. And we're talking about some crimes that are non-violent and receiving a sentence of less than 6 months. So we need to make sure that we're raising those concerns and that young people get the support through the voluntary sector around having a parent in prison, because it does impact on a child's emotional well-being. So what category of abuse is most common? Is it neglect, physical, sexual abuse, or emotional abuse? And this was based on the 2017-2018 child protection plans. And it was 48% was for neglect. And neglect covers a wide range of things. So it does include domestic violence as well, in terms of a failure to protect, neglecting to protect a child. And obviously we think about those stereotypical neglect cases where there is a child's living in poverty, there's not enough food in the house, that there's very unclean home conditions, and that the children turn up to school scruffy. That's what we tend to think about neglect, but it can cover lots of other factors as well. As I said, failure to protect is one of those. So how many young people whose parents live with a parent who has a substance or misuse or addiction? So is it 470,000, 350,000, 260,000, or 260,000. Excuse my typos, too many O's, too many zeros there. And it is 470,000. And children with mental health in their family, the figures are 900,000, 500,000, or 250,000. And the answer is 900,000. So it's quite stark figures what our children are living with in their homes. So why do ACEs matter, and how does it affect children's development? So what we know about children is that they need nurturing, stable, engaging environments, and that they've got relationships that help them to grow up happy, healthy, and emotionally regulated. And what we know is we all have stress in life, and children are no different. So you have positive stresses for children, which is part of everyday normal development, and it's characterized by a brief increase in heart rate, mild elevations of hormone levels, and it triggers the positive stress response to help young people cope with that stress. But what we know about toxic stress, so that is when children experience frequent, long-term, prolonged adversity, and that impacts on a child emotionally, and that could be through emotional abuse, chronic neglect, poor caregiver who's got a substance misuse or a mental health illness, and this can trigger stress response system that can impact on the child's brain development and other organ systems and increase the risk of heart disease, cognitive functioning well into adult years. And that's the part around ACEs. It doesn't just impact on children now, it impacts on them in the future. And that's why it's important that we respond to concerns that we've got about a child to reduce the impact that that has on that young person's long-term outcomes. And if we're thinking about children in sport, what we know about stress is that when we've got positive stress, that helps our performance. It increases our adrenaline, it kicks in, and it heightens our performance. But if we get to a position where a young person is constantly in that toxic stress situation, that means that they're not able to self-regulate, they're not able to switch off the stress responses, and they're in a heightened state of anxiety. And that can impact on a child's physical and emotional well-being, and will have a detrimental effect on their sport performance. So the importance of ACEs. So I've already briefly spoke about the correlation between the more ACEs you've got, the more poor health outcomes that a person will have. And what we know, Sport England are encouraging us all to be active, and they've got the Active Nation strategy. And ACEs should be a part of our thought processes around that, because as I've said, if we've got toxic stress and it's excessive, then that increases somebody's um, potentials for diseases, social problems, smoking, drinking. That also increases those negative impacts of other of negative behaviours. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that we understand how it can impact on a child. So in terms of their long-term outcomes, we could adults can develop things like alcoholism, liver disease, asthma, chronic health, lung disease, obesity, unemployment, smoking, drinking, smoking, drinking. These are all negative impacts that we know if somebody's got children that have increased ACE scores, they're going to impact and have negative behaviours, which again are going to impact on their abilities. So if you've got an ACE score of 5 or more, you are more likely to develop 4 times more likely to develop liver disease, coronary heart disease, and obesity as well. And one of the scary things around the figures when I was doing some research was that if you've got 6 or more, you you have on average, people died 20 years earlier. So what are the benefits of sport, and how does that help with children who have a higher ACE score? So what we know about sport is that it helps children to explore the world around them and to interact with other children and to understand things like empathy, respect, taking turns, those social norms that we have within society. And that's really important that children do have sport to be able to balance out some of the negative things. And it helps with problem solving, understanding the rules of the game, having self-control over your body, and gives positive reinforcements for children. So if we've got a coach who's given loads of feedback, positive feedback to a young person, that's going to help their emotional resilience. And what we know about sport is it reduces the sources of stress. So if young people are participating in sport, it reduces the stress responses, it reduces inflammation, it helps them to develop practicing coping skills and gives them a sense of security because they have a role within a team. So, in terms of what we can do to support children who have a higher ACE score, is we can look at after school activities. So for the active partnerships out there, that could be something that we're encouraging providers to go and work in lots of different communities around physical activities after school. And it might be about kind of those opportunities to build positive relationships. And we know sport helps to build resilience, helps to build character for a young person, and helps them to develop coping strategies to be able to overcome adversity. And one of the other things that we could do is to think about mentorship. So within active partnerships, I know when I've been going around talking to some of the active partnerships, they're engaged in a lot of community groups. And that might be something that young people would benefit from, is having a positive role model in their lives that would be able to be a good mentor for them. And it might be that you are linked in with things like home start or mindfulness, yoga, that types of things that would help a young person's stress responses. But the biggest thing that we can do is we can intervene and learn the lessons from the ACEs score, the original ACEs score that was done in San Diego, and try and prevent it from happening in the future. So if we know that there's domestic violence, we know that a child is living in an environment where there's drugs and alcohol and that there's abuse going on, we need to be able to intervene early and refer those concerns to children's services. I don't know whether people are familiar with I Coach Kids. So these are really good resources that can help coaches, and you can signpost your coaches to that and your voluntary sector community groups around this free resource that's available for you to be able to access. And it looks at the impact of physical activity and how it helps children with their physical, social, emotional, and cognitive abilities, and that will help children to reach their full potential. And one of the things I think we need to be mindful, being coaches and involved in young people's lives, is our own stress responses as well. So if we are a coach or if we're a volunteer in a club, that we are aware of our own sense of self, and that if we are feeling stressed ourselves, how will that be picked up by the children? So I think we need to take a little gauge of ourselves to make sure that we are not transferring our own stresses onto children. The other thing that we could do is we could be positive role models as well, and not to be judgmental of those children, and be supportive, get alongside them and help them to develop trust in relationships and give that positive attention back to young people, build them the self-esteem and confidence up on a regular basis. And we can do that by taking the time to get to know the young people in our clubs and what helps them and supports them to be able to tick and get the best out of their physical performance. Building on what we need to be doing in terms of intervening, I always think that it's really important that we remember the 5 R's. So can we recognise when a child is living in conditions that we've already talked about? Have we responded to that? Are we reporting it to the right people, whether it be your lead officer, if you haven't got a lead officer, the active partnership, or report it to a school? If you're linked in with a school, you could talk to the safeguarding officer at the school and refer it to children's services and record the concerns that you've got. So if there's a bit of a pattern happening with a child's home, community, make sure that we're keeping a record of that, so we know that so we can pass that information on to children's services and show and demonstrate that there's a pattern of behaviour here. And just wanted to finish off by saying that it's not our responsibility to decide whether a child's being abused or living in an abusive situation, but what it is our responsibility is to act on those concerns. And what we need to be doing is we need to be making sure that we're clarifying any information and reporting our concerns to the relevant agencies, which might be schools, children's services, the NSPCC helpline as well. So I hope that helped you understand a bit more about ACEs and what we can do in the sports sector to help young people with concerns regarding living in an environment where it's toxic, creating toxic stress.